Welcome to Aman Jaiswal's YouTube channel. Today's topic is the exposure triangle in photography. The exposure triangle forms the basis of all photography. The exposure triangle consists of three elements: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. All these three things are designed in such a way that it affects the amount of light that falls on the sensor. Let's look at each of these three things and how they impact the light and the end result that we want in the photograph. Let's first look at shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration for which the shutter opens and closes. Now, depending on the duration for which the shutter is open, the amount of light that falls on the sensor can be more or less. The shutter speed is given in the fraction of a second. When we fix the shutter speed on 100, it means the shutter speed is 1/100 of a second. Similarly, if we fix it at 500, it is 1/500th of a second. So the higher the number that we use, the shorter is the duration for which the shutter is open. Now let's look at how shutter speed is relevant to the exposure triangle. Let's say that we want to take a photograph of a sports event or a fast moving object or a child, etc. We have to be quick, or else the subject we want to focus on will become blurred. This means that the shutter speed has to be fast. Now, depending on the light conditions, we will have to adjust the aperture and ISO in order to get the appropriate amount of light on the sensor to get a good photograph. However, if the item is stationary, we have the ability to use a longer duration shutter speed to take the photograph, and accordingly the aperture and the ISO will be adjusted. Many digital cameras do this automatically if we use shutter speed priority setting. We can also use the shutter in bulb mode, which means that the shutter is continuously open as long as the release button is pressed on the camera. Now this also helps us to take some interesting photographs. Let's look at aperture and how is it connected to the exposure triangle. The aperture is the amount of opening in the lens that allows the light to come onto the sensor. The smaller the aperture, the lesser the amount of light which can go onto the sensor. The larger the aperture, the more the light can go onto the sensor. The aperture is given in numbers that we call stop number. Some of them are 5.6, 8, 11 and 16. The higher the number, the smaller the aperture. Each stop number doubles the amount of light passing through the aperture. So for example, a 8 stop will have double the light passing through it as compared to 11f stop. Apart from the amount of light that passes through the aperture, it can also be used to increase or decrease the depth of field. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest element that are in sharp focus. So if you want to highlight a particular object in the frame without bringing in the focus of the background, we will have to use a larger aperture which will reduce the depth of field. This type of effect is also called the bokeh effect, as you can see in this photograph. Here, because of the large aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO will have to be adjusted accordingly. But if we fix the ISO and use a large aperture to reduce the depth of field, then we only have the shutter speed to adjust to get the right photograph. Similarly, if we want to have a higher depth of field, we will have to use a smaller aperture, say f8, f-stop and higher, and accordingly adjust the ISO and shutter speed. Now let's look at the ISO and how is it relevant to the exposure triangle. The ISO defines the sensitivity of the sensor. So depending on if the sensitivity is high or low, the amount of light needed for a good photograph can be low or high. The ISO is defined by numbers and the range can vary from 100 and as high as 32,000 depending on the type of camera that you use. So when the lighting conditions are poor and the amount of light is low, we have to use a higher ISO number, and similarly the other way around. Let's take some examples. If we have to take a photograph in broad daylight or near the sea, which is very bright because of the reflection from the water, or if you are in the mountain where there is a lot of snow, then you will have to use a much smaller ISO so that the photograph is not overexposed, because each of these places have a very bright lighting condition. Another factor that we have to consider while selecting the ISO is that the higher the ISO number increases in our photographs, we tend to have more and more grainy photographs. This means if the photographs that you are taking have to be seen on a large surface or as a blow up and have been taken with a high ISO number, then we are likely to see grains in the photograph. Thus, the ISO should be selected keeping the end result in mind and as well as the lighting conditions in which we are taking the photograph. I am sure that you would have been able to understand the linkages between the three basic elements of photography: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Each of them are designed to increase or decrease the amount of light that is available for use of the sensor while taking the photograph, and they affect each other. In summary, if you were to increase the shutter speed, you could use a bigger aperture or you could use a higher ISO number to take the same photograph. Similarly, if you wanted to take a picture with a larger depth of field and you used a smaller aperture but the light conditions were little low, then either you could increase the ISO number or you could decrease the shutter speed of the camera to get the right photograph. If you like my video, please like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon so that when I upload my next video you could get notified, and please do comment.